Art is a language that few speak, but all understand. Humans are the ones that turn paint into pictures, sounds into orchestration, and movement into magic. We are not artists, but magicians who don't understand the phenomena of our own tricks. The more one looks, the more absurd art becomes. One slaps linseed oil and pigment onto a surface of dead plants to make an arrangement of shapes, colors, and edges. One arrangement capturing and exalting, another boring, and yet another insulting. In all logical senses, this practice is downright insanity. However, with every seemingly illogical phenomena, there is often a reason that begs to be brought to light. Since science has made little headway in understanding art, this field primarily falls within psychology, particularly perception. After 30 years of intensive research following his seminal work, A Pattern Language, Christopher Alexander concluded that art reflects the nature of the universe. In his series, The Nature of Order, Christopher Alexander states that Descartes' mechanistic view of the world is pragmatic, but wholly incomplete in explaining reality. Science works by decontextualizing, while reality operates through systems that cannot be fully understood mechanistically. For example, consider the tides. The Earth cannot be fully understood without the Moon, and the Moon's orbit cannot fully be understood without the Earth, both of which are governed by the Sun, creating an interconnected system that cannot be reduced to individual parts. Context, associations, and a web of causality define the nature of the universe. And this is also particularly how perception works. Painters are often confused by concepts like color theory and the relativity of values. Why does something look green outdoors but red indoors? Why do identical values appear as different shades depending on their arrangement in a composition? This is because, on a physical level, an object is not truly the same in different environments. Quantum physics reinforces this idea, showing that even measurement itself can change the behavior of light. Given this, some might conclude that if everything is relative, then it must also be arbitrary. However, this is one of the most misleading conclusions in art. Just because a shape works in one area of a canvas and not in another doesn't make it random. It means it's shaped by context. This explains why breaking the rules in art sometimes works. It depends entirely on how, where, and why the rule is broken. Perception can therefore be understood as an extension of the same natural phenomena that govern the universe. Gestalt psychologists in the early 20th century discovered that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. However, they didn't explore why this fundamental structure of composition exists. Why does music have a chorus, painting a focal subject, literature a climax, and architecture a primary motive? The so-called laws of composition explain what makes art resonate with us, but not why it resonates. A deeper analysis has led many artists to conclude that composition works best when its parts relate to the whole in a way that establishes an organizing center. This center balances and unifies the subservient elements. However, did anybody ever stop to ask why this is, or why this pattern is so pervasive? Currently, many people lament that art no longer has life. They describe it as dead, soulless, mechanical, and inhuman. These adjectives are unlikely to be random. Instead, they reflect a deeper intuitive judgment about the places and things we create. These critiques point to a more technical misunderstanding that modern man has of the nature of art, composition, and the very nature of reality itself. These concerns are what deeply troubled Alexander and can arguably be said to be the most fundamental motivation behind his life's work. Christopher Alexander suggests that our perception of life in artwork stems from the universe's natural organization of matter, strictly the ontological laws governing the natural laws, where context defines everything and nothing can exist in isolation as the same thing. For example, consider 3 tennis balls in a line in outer space. Physics dictates that each ball exerts a gravitational pull on the other. The middle ball, however, experiences forces from the lateral balls. This makes the middle ball experience more force than the lateral ones. This requires it to have more mass for a balanced system. This introduces the concept of the principal center. In visual terms, this balance involves visual weight, a concept Arnheim and others explore. Physical and visual weight often differ, but visually, difference is what balances a composition. For instance, making the middle ball darker in Figure 2 emphasizes its role as the primary center, highlighting the idea that difference is the primary driver of visual weight. Difference is the primary driver of visual weight. Composition fundamentally involves arranging centers so the principal center is distinct enough to mediate other forces. And oddly enough, physical matter employs these value differences as well in their principal centers. Difference operates within dichotomies: light, dark, soft, hard, large, small. While certain qualities may naturally draw more attention, the principle of difference surpasses these inherent preferences. This explains why the darker center object in Figure 2, standing out despite the lighter elements typically being more visually appealing. When the system is already balanced, no mediating principle is needed. These principles underpin 3 main composition types in art and architecture. The first is symmetrical composition, which achieves balance without needing a differentiated center. The second uses symmetry and a principal center to mediate the forces. And finally, 3 centers where the principal center is different enough to mediate unequal lateral forces. In architecture, a Doric column demonstrates the first type, with its elongated line of symmetry as the principal center. Nebraska's state capitol exemplifies the second, balancing the vertical and horizontal elements with a central mass and bilateral symmetry. The third, in Abbot Thayer's painting, shows lateral figures of different sizes requiring a larger mediating figure in the middle. In painting, the third compositional type is often used because symmetrical balance is rarely feasible due to the complexity of a representational medium, including perspective distortion and the arrangement of physically independent objects. The best a painter can achieve is part symmetry. Unlike architecture, which is the object itself rather than the representation, balance in architecture can more easily be achieved through symmetry. However, in painting, asymmetry is often relied upon to address these challenges of representation where no perfectly symmetrical solution exists. Most paintings, including many of mine, are entirely asymmetric. Balance is essential, and asymmetry often achieves this, especially when the principal center is off-center. For example, in my painting Gorge, the figure on the right is balanced by the water mass on the left. These principles, grounded in physical reality, provide foundational tools that move beyond the rigid dogma of composition. Concepts like harmony, intensity, and contrast that have persisted since antiquity but are never explained. Our intuitive connection to visual phenomena, if pursued, inevitably uncovers a composition's underlying structure. Christopher Alexander uses the term centers instead of objects or things to emphasize context and relationships between elements. When designing centers, artists often rely on intuition. For instance, a painter arranging a composition might sense that some distances between centers feel too close, too far, or just right. However, what makes a composition resonate is much more complex than any single factor. The idea that objects exert forces is explored by Gestalt psychologist Rudolf Arnheim in his The Dynamics of Architectural Form. He discusses the dynamics of the spaces between centers, asserting that centers influence each other through a field of forces. For example, when adjusting the distances between 2 buildings in a modeling software, there comes a point where they feel too far apart, too close, or just right. Interestingly, the distance that feels right to the designer often aligns with what others perceive as appropriate, when comparing the different arrangements. Figure 7, for example, may resonate more strongly due to Christopher Alexander's void principle, which suggests that absence enhances presence in sequence. Like a pause before a musical chorus, the empty space in Figure 7 intensifies the vase. Although Figure 8 shows what we typically think of as a balanced composition in terms of spacing and the composition's bounding box, Figure 7 creates a stronger central focus through its spacing. This focus stabilizes the lateral forces of the other centers, making the composition feel monumental, and in some sense more balanced than Figure 8. This intensity, enhanced by triangulation and the void, gives Figure 7 a sense of grandeur, reminiscent of Abbot Thayer's painting. In contrast, Figure 8 feels calm and affable, while 6 feels uptight and reserved. Which composition is best depends on the intent and context. The best choice is relative to the other centers of a composition, but is never arbitrary when contextualized. For instance, in a spa setting where relaxation is key, Figure 8's calmness would best serve the space's purpose. The principal center in this case is the idea of relaxation, so the composition must support this goal. However, if Figure 7 were used, the whole narrative of the spa setting would conflict with the self-importance imposed by Figure 7. This associative effect of center's spacing also influences classical architecture. Intercolumniation, the spacing between columns, is carefully adjusted to suit different contexts and intentions, demonstrating the universal importance of these principles. On this note, large scale often leads to architectural compositions that feel more uptight. As outlined by Julian Gaudet in Elements and Theories of Architecture, the lintel span of stone is essentially the same regardless of column height. This means that smaller columns require a larger intercolumniation, while larger columns require a smaller span in proportion. This leads larger buildings to have tighter compositions, which work well for serious buildings, like the Palace of Justice in Brussels, where tight proportions reflect the programmatic seriousness of law and justice. However, this approach is less suited for large buildings intended for relaxation. In such cases, architects often divide the facade with more horizontal bands to create proportionally wider shapes, as seen in the Breakers facade in Newport, which appropriately was a summer vacation home. We've seen that different arrangements convey varying impressions of the importance or character of centers and the composition as a whole. Often, this is undeniable. Proportions are one of the most influential factors in this impression of character. This is clearly illustrated in Andrew Loomis's drawing of the head and hands, where he demonstrates the effect of different head shapes on the perceived character of a person. At this point, many theories attempt to explain this perceptual impression of different proportions. Cultural constructionists often assert that differences in character are simply association-driven, the result of long-standing cultural influences and experiences. There is merit to this position, and the debate between nature and nurture remains unresolved due to the complexity of the variables involved. However, I propose an alternative view that satisfies both sides and provides a plausible explanation for a perceptual impression of character among other visual phenomena. It is clear that we do not form these associations of character purely from cultural experience, but also from observing the natural world. For instance, when something is colossal in scale, like a mountain, it tends to take on a triangular shape. This is because, as Arnheim notes in the Dynamics of Architectural Form, a center changes when moving in a vertical dimension, whereas the horizontal dimension remains constant. Note back to an object not being the same depending on its context. This drives nature towards bilateral symmetry, but rarely horizontal symmetry. More clearly, as an object is raised from the ground, it must diminish in size to maintain the system's equilibrium and support. This means a perfect cylinder in a gravitational context is not a true tube, but one that slightly tapers. This principle also explains features like graduated fenestration, where windows decrease in size as they rise up a facade. If the windows are the same size as those below them, they will appear larger in comparison, even though they are not physically. This principle is reflected in many classical motives, from pediments to columns to the facade as a whole, where bilateral symmetry is present, but not a line of horizontal symmetry. Additionally, these elements often taper as they rise in the vertical direction, seen in features like entasis, rakic moldings, and water tables. Therefore, things like entasis are not just what some call optical corrections, but rather an adaptation of the form to the context of the centers that exist physically, one of which is gravity. This also puts into question the idea of Platonic forms actually being perfect.